The land agent's pen paused over her signature, and he looked up at her the way a man looks at someone he's certain will change her mind before the ink dries. $200. That was all it took to buy 62 acres of rock and scrub on the North Slope, the kind of ground that broke plow blades and broke men's spirits faster than that. And he was giving her the chance to walk away from it before the deed made it permanent. Behind the window glass, two ranchers stood with their hats pushed back, laughing low, the way men laugh when they've already decided how a story ends. She didn't look at them. She dipped the pen again and finished her name. The agent slid the deed across the counter like he was handing her a coffin nail, and told her, not unkindly, that he hoped she had somewhere else to sleep once the winter came, and that land gave her nothing back. She folded the paper once, put it inside her coat, and said she'd take her chances with the ground before she took charity from people who thought $200 made her a fool. Behind her, through the glass, the laughter kept going. It would not keep going forever. But she didn't know that yet, standing there with a folded deed and a coat too thin for the wind that was already starting to turn. If you're watching this from somewhere far from where this story took place, tell me in the comments where you're tuned in from tonight. And settle in, because we've got a long, quiet road ahead of us together. 6 weeks earlier, she had been standing in a kitchen that wasn't hers anymore, folding the last of her clothes into a trunk that had belonged to her husband's mother, and trying to do arithmetic that refused to come out right no matter how many times she ran the numbers. Her name was Constance Ledbetter, though most everyone in the valley had taken to calling her Widow Ledbetter within a month of the funeral, as if losing a husband had erased the name her own mother gave her. Her husband, Aaron, had died in March, thrown from a horse he'd ridden 1,000 times before, on a morning so ordinary that she'd made him eggs, and he'd complained they were too runny. And 4 hours later he was gone, and she was left with a debt she hadn't known existed, and a house that belongs to a bank in the county seat, not to her. The debt was the kind of thing men didn't discuss with their wives back then, not because they meant cruelty by it, but because they believed, in their particular blindness, that a woman's peace was worth more than her knowledge. Aaron had borrowed against the house 2 years before to cover a bad season, and he'd meant to pay it back, and he would have, most likely, if a horse hadn't spooked at a rattlesnake on a Tuesday morning in March. Instead, Constance sat across from a banker named Whitmore, who explained to her, with the patient tone of a man explaining rain to a child, that she had 90 days to settle the note, or the house and the 11 acres it sat on would revert to the bank. She did not cry in front of him. She'd promised herself that much walking in, and she kept the promise, though it cost her something to keep it. She sold what she could: the good dishes, her mother's quilt, Aaron's tools that a neighbor's son had wanted for 2 seasons and finally got for less than they were worth, because grief is a poor negotiator. By the time the 90 days closed, she had covered the note with $11 to spare, and she had a small trunk, a bay mare named Dinah that nobody had offered to buy because she was getting on in years, and $211 that represented the whole of what remained of a marriage and a life. Everyone in the valley had an opinion about what a widow with $200 ought to do. Her sister-in-law, Prudence, wrote from 2 counties over, offering her a room and unpaid work minding 4 children, phrased as generosity. The church ladies suggested she might take in sewing, or teach the younger children their letters for a modest fee, or, if she was willing to travel, there was a cousin of someone's cousin out near Laramie who needed a housekeeper and wasn't particular about references. All of it amounted to the same suggestion, dressed in different clothes: that Constance Ledbetter ought to fold herself small enough to fit into whatever space a decent, dependent woman was supposed to occupy, and be grateful for the fitting. She thanked them all, and she meant it, because their intentions were kind even where their imaginations were narrow. But she had grown up on her father's cattle operation in the Nations before her family moved west, and she'd spent her childhood watching him read land the way other men read newspapers, and something in her refused the smallness they were offering. She wanted ground. Not because she was proud, though she had her pride, but because ground was the one thing that couldn't be taken back once it was legally hers, and because she had watched her father turn worthless creek bottom into the best hay ground in 3 counties by understanding what the water was doing underneath it before anyone else troubled to look. So instead of writing back to Prudence, she rode Dinah out along the roads that circled the valley, looking at land the way her father had taught her to look at it, which was to say, looking at what the land was doing rather than what it appeared to be. Most of the good bottomland was spoken for, owned by families 3 generations deep who wouldn't part with an inch of it for less than triple its worth. What remained for sale was the leftover ground, the pieces nobody wanted. And among those pieces was 62 acres on the north slope above Miller's Creek that had passed through 4 owners in 15 years, each of them losing money on it before selling it off to the next fool. The land was locally famous for being worthless. It sat on a rise of broken shale and granite outcrop that made plowing impossible in most places and difficult everywhere else. 2 previous owners had tried to farm it and failed within a season. A third had tried running cattle on it and lost half his herd to poor grazing and thin water before giving up and selling to a rancher named Otis Granger, who currently held the deed and was, by all accounts in town, desperate to unload it before winter forced him to keep paying taxes on ground that earned him nothing. Constance rode up onto that north slope on a gray Tuesday morning in April, with nothing but Dinah under her, and a canvas bag with a shovel folded down inside it. And she spent 6 hours walking the ground on foot, leading the mare behind her, doing what her father had called reading the skin of the earth. She noted where the grass, thin as it was, grew thicker in irregular patches that had no obvious relation to sun or shade. She noted a line of scrub willow running along a fold in the land that had no visible creek to explain it, willow being a tree that, in her experience, did not grow without water somewhere close beneath it. She noted that the granite outcrops, ugly and useless as they looked for plowing, held heat through the cool spring nights in a way that kept frost off the low grass around their bases longer than anywhere else on the slope. None of it was proof of anything. It was suggestion, the kind of pattern a person spends years learning to notice and still can't always explain to someone who hasn't spent those years looking. But suggestion was enough for Constance, because she had $211 and a stubborn belief that her father's eye for ground hadn't skipped a generation just because she wore a dress instead of trousers when she rode. She went to see Otis Granger 2 days later, and the conversation between them was short because Otis wanted shed of that land more than he wanted a fair price for it, and Constance had learned enough from watching Aaron get outmaneuvered by better negotiators that she wasn't inclined to overpay out of politeness. $200, she told him, cash, today, and he could keep whatever fencing was still standing, because she doubted much of it was worth hauling off anyway. Otis looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone offering to take a burden off his hands. And then he laughed, not unkindly, and said if she was fool enough to want it, he wasn't going to argue her out of $200 for ground he'd have paid someone else to take. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, the whole valley knew that the widow Ledbetter had spent every dollar she had left in the world on the Granger rock ground, the ground 3 men before her had already failed on. And by Thursday afternoon, the laughter had started in earnest, the kind of laughter that travels through a small valley faster than any letter could, carried on the backs of men who found her decision the funniest thing they'd heard since the county fair. It was in that laughter that she signed the deed at the land office, with the agent double-checking her signature and the 2 ranchers laughing behind the glass. And it was that laughter she carried with her, folded up alongside the deed, as she rode Dinah back up the slope toward the 62 acres that were now, for better or for far worse, entirely her own. The house on the property, if it could be called that, was a single-room structure with a dirt floor and a roof that had given up on half its shingles sometime in the previous owner's tenure. It would need work before winter, and work cost money she didn't have much left of. But she had $11 and a stubborn constitution, and those two things had gotten Aaron's family through worse winters than this one promised to be. She spent her first night on the property sleeping on a bedroll on that dirt floor, with Dinah picketed outside, listening to the wind move through granite and scrub willow. And she did not sleep well. But she did not regret the $200 either. Not yet. Not for a long while yet. Though there would be nights in the months ahead when the regret came close enough to touch. $2 ahead. That was the figure that would come to matter more than the 200. Though nobody in the valley knew it yet, including Constance herself, who spent her first week on the rock ground simply learning its moods before she made a single decision about what to do with it. She walked it in the mornings when the light was low and long, and she walked it in the evenings when the granite still held the day's warmth against the coming chill. And she began to understand what her instinct had sensed, but her arithmetic hadn't yet confirmed. The willows along that fold in the land were not decorative. They were markers, planted by nature the way a man plants a flag, telling anyone patient enough to read them that water moved somewhere beneath that ground, close enough to the surface to feed roots even in a dry spring. She had seen the same pattern on her father's creek bottom 30 years before, when he'd bought ground everyone called swampy nonsense, and turned it, within 3 years, into the finest hay meadow in the territory. Once he understood that the water beneath it wasn't a flaw to be drained, but an asset to be managed. But water alone wouldn't feed her through winter, and she needed income faster than any long-term plan for that hidden creek could provide. So she turned her attention to the other resource sitting in plain sight on that 62 acres. The resource everyone in the valley had looked straight past because they'd been taught to see it as worthless. The grazing itself. The ground was rocky, yes, and unplowable, yes, but rocky, unplowable ground still grew grass, thin and wiry as it was, threaded through with plants that a horse or a cow would turn its nose up at, but that another kind of animal would find perfectly agreeable. Goats did not care about rocks. Goats, if anything, preferred them, using granite outcrops as playgrounds and vantage points, and goats would eat scrub brush and thistle and the tough, low plants that no cattleman in the valley considered worth the trouble of grazing. Her father had run a small herd of goats alongside his cattle back in the Nations, more for milk and cheese than for any serious income. But she remembered enough of how he'd managed them to know that a herd of goats on 62 acres of otherwise useless ground could turn scrub into milk, milk into cheese, and cheese into money, faster and with less capital than almost any other venture available to her. The trouble was capital. She had $11, a roof that needed shingles, and a winter coming that didn't care about her plans. She could not simply ride to a livestock dealer and buy a herd of prime goats, because prime goats cost more than she had, and a woman alone with $11 did not get offered credit by cautious men in a valley that already thought her a fool. What she could get, as it turned out, was something else entirely. Word reached her within her second week on the property, carried by a boy delivering mail who mentioned it in passing because he had no idea it would matter to her, that a dairy operation 2 valleys over was liquidating its herd after a bad outbreak of foot rot had swept through their goats that spring. The owner, a man named Purcell, was desperate to be rid of the surviving animals before the sickness spread further and cost him the rest of his stock, and he was selling what remained at whatever price would move them off his land fastest. She rode 2 days to reach Purcell's place, leaving Dinah with a neighbor and borrowing a wagon from Otis Granger, who seemed to feel some obligation toward the woman he'd sold worthless ground to, and was willing to lend the wagon without much interest in what she wanted it for. What she found at Purcell's operation was 37 goats in poor condition, limping and thin, coats dull, several of them with the telltale swelling in their hooves that marked the foot rot everyone in that valley was afraid of catching in their own herds. Purcell wanted them gone. He named a price of $2 a head, cash, and told her plainly that most buyers who'd come looking had taken one glance at the limping animals and turned their wagons back around, unwilling to risk bringing infection home to healthy stock. $2, 37 goats, $74 for the whole sickly, coughing, limping lot of them. And every rancher who heard about that transaction in the weeks that followed would repeat the number like it was the punchline to a joke that told itself. But Constance had grown up around livestock sickness the way other children grew up around church, and she knew something the ranchers laughing about her purchase did not trouble themselves to learn. Foot rot in goats, while ugly and painful for the animal, was almost always treatable if caught in time and tended properly, and it was rarely fatal on its own. What killed animals with foot rot wasn't the rot itself, most often, but neglect, wet standing conditions, and owners too busy or too indifferent to do the unglamorous daily work of cleaning and trimming and dressing each hoof by hand. She paid Purcell his $74, loaded 37 miserable, limping goats into Otis Granger's borrowed wagon, and drove them the 2 days back to her rocky 62 acres, arriving with $11 left to her name, and a herd that every person who saw it along the road assumed she'd bought as an act of charity or an act of madness. Possibly both at once. The work that followed was not glamorous, and it was not the kind of work anyone wrote songs about. For 3 weeks, Constance rose before dawn and worked until the light failed, going animal by animal through her sickly herd, cleaning hooves with a knife and brush, cutting away infected tissue with a steady hand that surprised even her some mornings, packing the wounds with a mixture of pine tar and salt that her father had sworn by decades before, and keeping every goat on dry, elevated ground away from the mud and standing water that let the infection spread and worsen. It was filthy work. It smelled of rot and tar and animal sweat, and it left her hands cracked and stinging by the second week. But it was work she understood in her bones, and every evening she could see, if she looked closely enough, that the animals were standing a little straighter than the day before. There were nights in that first month when the doubt came for her, the way it comes for anyone who has bet everything on a belief nobody else shares. She would sit outside her half-roofed house after the goats had settled, looking at the dark shapes of them scattered across the granite outcrops, and she would think about the $74 and the $200 and the $11 remaining, and she would wonder, in the honest quiet of those hours, whether she had simply proven everyone right, whether grief had made her reckless instead of clever, and whether she'd mistaken her father's memory for her own competence. She never said these doubts aloud to anyone. She wrote them, some of them, in a small ledger book she'd bought for 30 cents in town, alongside every dollar spent and every dollar she hoped someday to see come back to her. The ledger did not care about her doubts. It only cared about the numbers, and the numbers, slowly, patiently, began to change. By the end of the 3rd week, 31 of the 37 goats were sound on their feet again, grazing the rocky slope with the particular enthusiasm goats bring to difficult terrain. And the 6 that remained troubled were healing slower, but healing all the same. She had lost none of them, not one. And on an evening in early May, sitting on the granite outcrop that had become her favorite thinking spot on the property, watching her recovered herd pick through scrub brush that no rancher in the valley would have valued at a nickel an acre, she allowed herself, For the first time since Aaron's funeral, something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. The valley, of course, had not forgotten about her. If anything, the valley's attention had sharpened rather than faded in the weeks since her purchase, because the story of the fool widow who'd bought sick goats and worthless rock had proven too entertaining to let go stale. It traveled the way these stories travel in small places, growing a little each time it changed hands, until by the time it reached the ears of a rancher named Silas Kettleman, it had become something close to legend. The widow on the north slope who'd spent every dollar she had on a dying herd and land that couldn't grow a decent weed. Silas Kettleman was not, on the surface, a villain of the kind found in dime novels. He owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, some 4,000 acres running along the good bottomland below the rock ground. And he had built that operation through a combination of genuine skill and a willingness to buy out neighbors at prices that favored him whenever hardship gave him the opening. He had made an offer on Otis Granger's rock ground 18 months before Constance ever rode up that slope, a low offer, because he'd wanted the water rights that ran with it more than he'd wanted the ground itself. And Otis had turned him down out of stubbornness rather than any calculation about value. Kettleman had been waiting patiently for the ground to change hands again at a price he found more agreeable, and instead it had gone to a widow with $200 who'd beaten him to a purchase he'd assumed would eventually fall into his lap. He did not say any of this aloud, not at first, and not to her directly. What he did instead, in the weeks after her herd began recovering, was mention to a few of the right people in town, in the offhand tone of a man simply making conversation, that he'd heard the water on that rock ground ran unreliable most summers, that he'd looked at it himself years back and decided against it for exactly that reason, and that he wondered, in a spirit of neighborly concern, how a woman with no hired help intended to keep a herd watered through a dry August with nothing but a hand pump and whatever she could carry in buckets. It was the kind of talk designed to plant doubt without ever being traceable back to malice, and it worked exactly as intended, seeping into the valley's ongoing conversation about Constance Ledbetter and adding a new thread of concern to the general amusement. Not only had she bought worthless rock and dying goats, but now respectable opinion, voiced by a man who owned 4,000 acres and presumably knew what he was talking about, suggested she'd be dry and desperate before the summer was through. Constance heard the talk secondhand, the way a person always hears the worst talk about themselves, filtered through a well-meaning neighbor woman named Hattie Combs, who rode up one afternoon with a jar of preserves and an apologetic look, and relayed what was being said in town, partly out of genuine concern, and partly, Constance suspected, because Hattie couldn't quite help herself. Constance thanked her for the preserves and for the warning, both, and said nothing about the willows along that fold in the land, because a woman with $200 and a fool's reputation had learned already that her best defense was silence and results, not arguments nobody in town was inclined to believe anyway. That evening, after Hattie's wagon had disappeared back down the slope, Constance walked the line of scrub willow with her shovel over her shoulder, and she began to dig. She dug in 3 places along that fold in the land over the following week, working in the cool hours before the sun climbs too high, and in 2 of the 3 places she found nothing but rock and dry clay for her trouble, blistering her palms for no reward. But in the 3rd place, where the willows grew thickest and the grass beneath them held a green that never quite faded, even through the dry stretches of April, she dug down through 18 inches of soil and struck something that made her sit back on her heels and simply breathe for a moment before she trusted herself to keep digging. Damp clay. Then, another foot down, standing water, cold and clear, filling the hole almost as fast as she could clear it. A spring, or something close enough to one, sitting beneath that unremarkable fold in ground that 3 previous owners had walked over 1,000 times, without ever once putting a shovel into the earth to see what was underneath their boots. She did not run into town shouting the discovery, because a woman alone with a hidden spring on her property was, she understood immediately, more vulnerable than a woman with dying goats and useless rock, particularly with a neighbor like Silas Kettleman sitting on 4,000 acres and a long memory for the water rights he'd wanted 18 months before. Instead, she spent 3 days working quietly, deepening the hole into a proper well shaft, lining it with stone she gathered from the very granite outcrops that had made the ground unplowable in the first place, until she had a working well that filled steadily and cleanly, and would, by her calculation, water a herd twice the size of hers through the driest month the valley was likely to see. It was not luck, though it might have looked like luck to anyone who hadn't watched her work for it. It was the willows, read correctly, and the granite, understood rather than cursed, and 3 days of blistered hands confirming what a careful eye had already suspected weeks before. Her father used to say that the land never lied to you. It only waited to see if you were patient enough and humble enough to ask it the right questions. And standing over that stone-lined well with water rising cold and clean toward the surface, Constance understood, in a way she hadn't fully understood before that moment, that she had actually done it. Not gotten lucky, done it, through the plain, unglamorous combination of memory, observation, and work that nobody in the valley had credited her with possessing. She kept the well quiet through the rest of May, watering her recovering herd from it in the early mornings and late evenings when the chance of being observed from the road below was smallest, and she began, in her small ledger book, to sketch out the next stage of a plan that had started as pure survival and was beginning, cautiously, to look like something more ambitious than that. Her father had taught her to make cheese the way he'd taught her most things, by doing it alongside her rather than explaining it in words, and she still remembered the sequence of it in her hands, even if her mind sometimes struggled to recite the steps aloud. Goat's milk cheese was not common in that valley. The ranchers ran cattle, and the few dairy operations nearby produced cow's milk cheese, heavy and mild, sold at a fair but unremarkable price in the county seat. A herd of 37 healthy goats, properly milked and properly managed, could produce a cheese that no other operation within 2 days' ride was making. And cheese, unlike raw milk, could be stored, transported, and sold at a price that reflected the skill in the making, rather than just the volume of the milk. It was an ambitious plan for a woman with $11, a half-roofed house, and a herd she'd bought for $2 a head 6 weeks before. But ambition, she was learning, cost nothing extra once you'd already spent everything you had on the parts that seemed impossible. The parts that remained, the milking and the culturing and the pressing and the aging, were simply work, and work she understood, even if she'd have to relearn some of the finer points through trial and the kind of failure that taught more than success ever did. She began milking in the first week of June, once her herd was fully recovered, and the does that were producing had settled into a rhythm that let her collect a modest but steady supply each morning. Her first attempts at cheese were, by her own private admission in the ledger, not good. The first batch curdled wrong and had to be fed to the hogs she didn't own. So instead, it went to feed the chickens she'd traded 3 of her goat kids for from a neighbor, an even trade that at least meant nothing went entirely to waste. The second batch held together but tasted flat, missing whatever quiet alchemy her father's hands had always known and hers hadn't yet relearned. It was the 5th batch, made in the 2nd week of June, with milk from does that had settled into full production, and a culture she'd finally gotten right after asking careful questions of an old dairy hand 2 valleys over, who was more willing to share his knowledge than most people in her own valley, that came together the way she remembered her father's cheese coming together. Firm, tangy, with a texture that held its shape when she pressed a knife through it. She sat alone in her half-roofed house that evening with a wedge of that fifth batch on a chipped plate in front of her, and she ate it slowly, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she cried. Not from sadness, from something closer to relief, the particular relief of a person who has bet everything on a belief in herself and finally received, in the smallest possible form, proof that the belief hadn't been misplaced. News of a working cheese operation on the rock ground reached the valley slower than news of dying goats and worthless land had, because there was less entertainment in a woman quietly succeeding than there had been in a woman appearing to fail. And gossip, Constance was learning, traveled fastest downhill. But it did reach town eventually, carried by the same dairy hand 2 valleys over who'd helped her with her culture, and who mentioned, in passing to a few customers at the mercantile, that the widow Ledbetter's goat cheese was turning out finer than anything he'd tasted from a dairy in years. Silas Kettleman heard this the way he heard most things that concerned his interests, quickly and through channels he trusted, and it troubled him more than he let show. His concern was not, primarily, about goat cheese. His concern was about water. A woman who'd found a way to keep 37 goats healthy and productive through a dry June had solved the exact problem he'd been quietly suggesting would ruin her, and a solved problem on that piece of ground meant the water rights he'd wanted 18 months before were now demonstrably valuable in a way they hadn't been when the ground sat idle and unclaimed by anyone competent enough to use it. He rode up to see her himself in the 3rd week of June, the first time he'd bothered to visit the rock ground since she'd bought it, and he found her at the edge of her herd, with her sleeves rolled up and her hands cracked from work, and he made her, without much preamble, an offer to buy the 62 acres back from her at $400, double what she'd paid, framed as a generous gesture toward a widow who surely didn't want to spend another summer working herself to exhaustion on ground that had already tested her patience enough. $400 was more money than Constance had held in her hands at any point since Aaron's death. And there was a version of her, a tired version, who remembered every blistered morning and every doubt-filled night that felt the pull of it. But she had spent 6 weeks reading that ground the way her father had taught her to read ground, and she understood, standing there in front of Silas Kettleman's tailored coat and patient smile, that a man who owned 4,000 acres of prime bottomland did not ride up personally to offer double the price on 62 acres of rock, unless the rock was worth considerably more to him than $400. She told him she'd think on it. She did not tell him about the stone-lined well, or the willows, or the cheese that was, at that very moment, aging in a cool dugout cellar she'd carved into the base of one of her granite outcrops. She simply thanked him for the offer, watched him ride back down toward the good bottomland, and went back to work, because thinking on it, for Constance Ledbetter, mostly meant continuing to do the work that made the thinking unnecessary. The lean stretch came, as it always does, right when the work seemed to be turning a corner, and it came in a form Constance hadn't fully prepared for. Late June brought a heat that settled over the valley and refused to lift. Day after day of relentless sun that browned even the good bottomland grass and turned the county's talk toward drought instead of gossip about widows and worthless ground. Her well held, which was more than could be said for 2 of her neighbors' surface ponds that dried to cracked mud by the 2nd week of July. But the heat brought a different trouble entirely, one that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with a batch of cheese she'd been counting on to carry her through the coming months. She had built her aging cellar into the granite quickly, in the days after that first successful batch, working alone with a pick and shovel to hollow out a space cool enough to hold a steady temperature through the summer heat. It was good instinct, and adequate execution for a first attempt. But adequate was not the same as expert, and in the third week of July she discovered, opening the cellar one morning to check on her aging wheels, that a crack in the granite she hadn't noticed was letting warm air seep in from the surface, and that the heat had gotten into 6 of her 14 wheels and spoiled them beyond any hope of saving. 6 wheels of cheese represented weeks of milk, weeks of careful culturing, and money she genuinely could not afford to lose. And standing in that cellar with the ruined wheels in front of her, smelling of rot instead of the clean tang that marked good cheese, Constance came as close in that moment to genuine despair as she had at any point since burying Aaron in March. It would have been easy, in that moment, to hear Silas Kettleman's $400 echoing in her memory, and wonder if she'd been a fool to refuse it. It would have been easy to write to Prudence after all, and admit that the ground had beaten her, the way it had beaten every owner before her. She did not write that letter. Instead, she sat on the granite outside her cellar for the better part of an hour, doing what her ledger book called the hardest kind of arithmetic, which was not the arithmetic of dollars, but the arithmetic of what remained possible with what she still had. 8 wheels of good cheese remained, aging properly, and her herd was healthy and producing, and the well held clean and cold, no matter what the sun did to the surface above it. And she still had, if she was honest with the ledger, more resources than she'd started with 6 weeks before, even after the loss. She repaired the crack in the cellar the following week, packing it with clay and stone dust mixed to a paste, a technique she half remembered her father using on a root cellar decades before. And she began a second batch of cheese with the milk that hadn't stopped coming, just because 6 wheels had spoiled. It was during this stretch, the hardest of the whole summer, that a small ally appeared in the shape of a boy named Tommy Combs, Hattie's youngest, 12 years old and possessed of the kind of restless curiosity that made him wander further from home than his mother generally approved of. Tommy showed up at the edge of Constance's property one afternoon in late July, ostensibly looking for a stray dog, but in truth, simply curious about the widow everyone talked about. And instead of finding a defeated woman surrounded by failure, he found Constance up to her elbows in curds, working a batch of cheese with the kind of focused competence that impressed a 12-year-old boy more than any amount of adult reassurance could have. He asked, with the bluntness only children manage, why everyone in town said her land was worthless when she seems to be doing something with it that looked a great deal like succeeding. She told him simply that everyone in town had looked at the rock and stopped looking, and that the trick of the whole thing wasn't magic. It was just refusing to stop looking after the first glance told you no. Tommy came back 3 more times that week, first out of curiosity, and then, increasingly, because Constance let him help with small tasks, feeding the goats, hauling water, learning the careful patience of checking a cheese wheel's rind for the first signs of trouble. He was the first person in the valley to believe in what she was doing without needing proof first. And though he was only 12 and had no money and no influence, his belief mattered to her more than she let show, because belief, freely given, had been in short supply since March. August brought the harvest of the well's true test, when the heat that had spoiled her cheese peaked into the driest stretch the valley had seen in 3 years. And it was in that stretch that Silas Kettleman made his final and most direct move. He had not forgotten his offer, and he had not forgotten being refused. And a man who had built 4,000 acres through patient acquisition did not simply let a refusal stand without testing it further, particularly once the drought made water the single most valuable thing in the valley. He went, in the second week of August, to the bank in the county seat, where he held considerable influence through decades of business and a friendship with the same Whitmore who had once explained Constance's debt to her with such patient condescension. And he arranged, through channels Constance never fully understood until much later, to have the small remaining note on her original marital debt, the $11 she'd thought long settled, reopened on a technicality regarding an unpaid filing fee that Aaron had apparently missed before his death. It was not a large sum, $11 and some accumulated interest, perhaps $18 total. A trivial amount to a man like Kettleman, but a deliberately calculated pressure against a woman he knew had very little cash on hand after 2 months of buying feed, repairing a cellar, and investing everything back into a herd and an operation that hadn't yet turned a real profit. The bank sent word that the amount was due within 2 weeks, or the matter would be referred for collection, a phrase designed to sound more threatening than the actual sum warranted. And word of the reopened debt, predictably, made its way through town within days, reviving the old talk about the widow Ledbetter and her doomed venture with fresh energy. Constance understood immediately, reading the notice at her kitchen table by lamplight, exactly what had happened, and exactly whose hand had likely moved behind it, though she had no proof and would have gained nothing by accusing a man as respected as Silas Kettleman without it. She had $11 remaining from her original $200, plus a small amount earned from selling excess milk to a neighbor and from Tommy's father buying 2 of her young goats for breeding stock. It was not $18, not quite, and it was certainly not enough cushion to absorb a surprise debt while still needing to buy supplies to press her final batches of cheese before the season turned. That night was the closest Constance came to the edge of everything she'd built. She sat outside on her granite outcrop long after dark, looking down at the lights of the town below, and she allowed herself, for perhaps 20 minutes, the full weight of exhaustion and doubt she'd been holding at bay since April. The blistered hands, the spoiled cheese, the laughter that had followed her from the land office to the mercantile, to every conversation she'd overheard secondhand for 4 months. And now, a debt, reopened by a man wealthy enough that $18 meant nothing to him, except as a tool to press her toward the sale he wanted. She did not have $18 to spare, but she had 8 wheels of properly aged cheese sitting in her repaired cellar, cheese that the dairy hand 2 valleys over had called finer than anything he'd tasted in years. Cheese she had been planning to bring to market gradually, wheel by wheel, to avoid flooding a small local demand and depressing her own prices. The debt notice changed her calculation. She needed cash, and she needed it inside 2 weeks, and the only asset she had that could produce it fast enough was sitting in that cellar, aging in the cool dark, waiting for a market that hadn't fully discovered it yet. She decided that night, on the granite outcrop under a sky full of more stars than she'd had the leisure to notice in months, that she would take her cheese to the county fair. The county fair was, in ordinary years, an event dominated by cattlemen and grain growers, a showcase for the valley's established agricultural pride, and a woman bringing goat cheese to sell from a rock-ground operation that half the valley still considered a joke was, on its face, an act of considerable risk. If the cheese failed to sell, or worse, if it failed to impress, she would have spent her last reserves of time and energy on a public failure that would follow her far longer than a quiet, private one ever could. But the fair also brought buyers from outside the valley, merchants and hotel keepers, and even a buyer from the railroad hotel 2 counties over, who came each year looking for local specialty goods to stock. And it was the one place in that whole stretch of territory where a fair price might actually be discovered rather than assumed. She spent the week before the fair working from before dawn until after dark, finishing her cheese, mending the one good dress she owned, and readying a small stall her father's old habits had taught her to build from scrap lumber and canvas. Simple but clean, the kind of stall that let the product speak rather than the presentation. Tommy Combs, against his mother's mild objections, spent 2 of those days helping her haul lumber and water, having appointed himself with the seriousness only a 12-year-old can bring to self-appointed duty, as her unofficial assistant for the whole enterprise. The morning of the fair arrived clear and hot, the kind of relentless August day that had defined the whole difficult summer, and Constance loaded 8 wheels of cheese into Otis Granger's wagon, which he'd lent her again without much hesitation, and drove down from the rock ground into town with her stomach tight and her ledger book tucked into her coat pocket like a talisman. The fairground buzzed with the usual crowd, cattlemen comparing bulls, women comparing preserves and quilts, children running between stalls with the particular energy August heat never seemed to diminish in the young. Constance set up her stall in a corner space she'd been assigned, not the prime location given to the established dairy operation from 2 valleys over, but a corner would do, she told herself, if the cheese was as good as she believed it was. For the first hour, almost nobody stopped. People glanced at her stall, recognized her, and moved on with the particular awkward speed of folks who'd spent months laughing about a story and weren't quite sure how to behave now that the subject of the laughter stood in front of them selling something. She kept her chin level and her hands steady, cutting small samples from one wheel and setting them out on a clean board. And she waited, the way she'd learned to wait through the whole long summer, patient as the willows that had first told her where the water lay. It was Hattie Combs, of all people, who broke the standoff, walking up to the stall with her particular blend of guilt and curiosity, and asking plainly if she might try a piece. Constance cut her a sliver and handed it across on the flat of her knife, and Hattie ate it and stopped talking mid-sentence, the way a person stops when a taste surprises them more than they expected it to. She bought a whole wheel on the spot, insisting on paying full price despite Constance's protest that she'd already been kind enough with the preserves back in April. And word of that purchase, in the particular way word moves through a crowded fairground, reached the next stall within minutes. A woman 2 stalls down came to look, then to taste, then to buy.
Then a man who ran the small hotel in town, tasting on behalf of his wife, who'd sent him to find something different to serve their boarders, bought 2 wheels outright and asked, before he'd even finished paying, whether Constance could supply more on a regular basis through the fall. By early afternoon, a small crowd had gathered around her corner stall, drawn as much by the low murmur of surprised approval as by the cheese itself. And it was into that crowd, drawn by curiosity about what all the sudden interest concerned, that Silas Kettleman himself walked, along with 2 of the ranchers who had laughed behind the land office glass back in April. Constance watched him approach with the same steady stillness she'd held all afternoon, and she watched his face as he reached the front of the small crowd and saw, for the first time, exactly what the widow he'd tried twice now to buy out had actually built on ground he'd once wanted for nothing more than its water rights. She cut him a sliver of cheese, the same as she'd cut for everyone else, and offered it across the flat of her knife without a word, because she had learned by then that her best answer to any of them had never been speeches. It had been work, offered plain, and left to speak for itself. He took it. He ate it, and for a long moment, standing in front of a crowd that included 2 of his own men, Silas Kettleman said nothing at all, which was, for a man who had spent the whole summer speaking quietly against her through channels he thought untraceable, its own kind of confession. It was one of the 2 ranchers beside him, a heavy-set man named Purdy, who'd been among the loudest voices laughing behind the land office glass in April, who broke the silence, laughing again, though this time the laugh came out thin and uncertain, and saying, loud enough for the crowd to hear, that he supposed the widow's fool goats had turned into something worth a look after all. He meant it, Constance understood even then, as a kind of grudging joke rather than a genuine apology,
The sort of thing a man says when he isn't quite ready to admit he was wrong, but can't quite manage to keep pretending he was right either. But he bought 2 wheels before he left the stall, paying without haggling, and that, in its own quiet way, said considerably more than his words had. By the time the fair closed that evening, Constance had sold every wheel of cheese she'd brought, along with promises from 3 separate buyers, including the railroad hotel man, for regular supply through the fall and into winter, if she could manage the volume. She drove Otis Granger's wagon back up toward the rock ground in the fading light, with an empty wagon bed and a cash box heavier than any amount of money she'd held since burying Aaron, and the $18 debt that had nearly broken her 2 weeks before was, by the time she reached her own gate, no longer a threat at all, but a line item she could settle the following morning without a second thought. She did settle it the following morning, riding into the bank in the county seat and paying Whitmore the full amount in cash, watching his face carefully as she counted it out, because she suspected, without proof she could ever use, that he understood exactly whose hand had reopened that debt, and exactly how satisfying it must have been for him to watch it settled so easily by a woman his friend Kettleman had assumed would fold under the pressure. The weeks that followed the county fair moved differently than the weeks before it had. Word of the widow Ledbetter's goat cheese spread through the valley and beyond it, with the same speed the earlier gossip about her failure had once traveled. Except now, the story carried in the other direction, and Constance found herself, by September, unable to keep pace with the orders coming in from town, from the railroad hotel, and eventually from a general store 2 counties over, that had heard about her cheese from a traveling salesman and wanted to carry it on their shelves. She expanded carefully, the way she did everything, adding 6 more does to her herd through a fair trade with a dairy operation that had heard of her success and was eager to be associated with it, and building a proper cheese house with real stone walls and a ventilation system designed correctly this time, learning from the crack that had cost her 6 wheels back in July, rather than repeating the mistake. Tommy Combs became a fixture on her property most afternoons after his chores were done, learning the whole operation with the kind of hungry attention that suggested, though neither of them said it aloud yet, that he might make a genuine hand at this kind of work when he was grown. And Hattie, embarrassed now by how much town gossip she'd once relayed, became instead one of Constance's most reliable customers, and something close to a genuine friend. Silas Kettleman did not trouble her again directly, though word reached her, second-hand, that he'd quietly abandoned whatever hope he'd held of acquiring her water rights through pressure, having understood, after the county fair, that the ground he'd once dismissed as worthless now belonged to someone who had made it worth considerably more than he'd ever have managed with it himself. He nodded to her once, that autumn, passing her wagon on the road into town, a small gesture that cost him nothing, and meant, in the particular language men like Kettleman used, as close to an acknowledgment as she was ever likely to receive from him. The land agent, who had double-checked her signature back in April, saw her again in October, when she rode into the land office not to sell the rock ground, but to inquire, with the calm confidence of a woman who now understood exactly what she was capable of reading in a piece of ground, about an adjoining 20 acres that had come up for sale. Ground even the current owner admitted was mostly granite outcrop and scrub. Ground nobody expected to be worth the asking price. The agent recognized her immediately, and this time, when she signed her name to the offer, he did not double-check the signature. He simply processed the paperwork, and if there was anything of the old amusement left in his expression, it had been replaced, plainly, by something closer to respect. Winter came to the valley the way it always did, hard and honest. But Constance Ledbetter met it from inside a cheese house with real stone walls, a well that had never once run dry through the whole difficult summer, a herd that had grown from 37 sickly goats to 51 healthy ones, and a cellar full of cheese wheels aging steadily toward a spring market that 3 separate buyers were already asking after. The $200 that had once seemed like the whole of what remained of her old life had become, within 8 months, the foundation of something the valley no longer laughed about, and the rocky ground that 4 owners before her had failed on had become, in the plain and unglamorous language of the county assessor's office, the most productive small operation on the north slope of the valley. She still kept her ledger book, filling its pages with the same careful arithmetic she'd started back in April, though the numbers in it now told a different story than the ones that had once kept her awake with worry. She still walked the property most mornings before the light climbed too high, not out of habit alone, but because she had never stopped believing that ground, properly read, always had more to tell a person willing to keep looking after the first glance said no. The willows along that fold in the land had grown thicker through the summer, feeding steadily on the water she'd found beneath them, and she had planted a row of new ones the following spring, not because she needed the marker anymore, but because she'd come to feel a particular gratitude toward the trees that had first told her the truth everyone else had walked past without asking. If there is a lesson in Constance Ledbetter's story, and I believe there is, it is not simply that worthless ground can hide worth beneath it, though that much is true enough on its own. It's that the worth was never actually hidden at all. It was sitting in plain view the whole time, in the willows and the granite and the animals everyone else had already written off, waiting for someone patient enough and humble enough to ask the ground the right questions instead of accepting the easy answer everyone before her had settled for. The valley had priced that ground once, back in April, at $200 and a round of laughter. But the land itself never agreed to that price. It only waited to see who would come along willing to work for what it was actually worth. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, I hope you'll carry a little of Constance's patience with you into whatever ground of your own you're standing on. The parts of your life that other people have already decided are worthless. The parts you might be tempted to walk away from, simply because someone else laughed first. Look a little closer before you believe them. The land never lies, but it does wait, and sometimes the only thing standing between where you are and where you're meant to be is the courage to keep digging after everyone else has already decided there's nothing there. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me. Rest well tonight, and I'll see you down the road.